everybody, and welcome back to The Wellness Dilemma. I'm Abby.
I'm Jenn.
And we're here today to talk about intergenerational trauma and just some considerations when supporting someone who may have this experience, or if maybe you've had this experience or have wondered if you did. It's a really big topic, so we're gonna give you kind of an overview, kind of a foundation. I'm guessing that we'll end up talking about this again, or maybe do a deeper dive into some of the aspects that we talk about today, but just to know that it's really complex, it's a really big topic, so we won't be able to cover it all in one episode. But yeah, we should get us, started off understanding it in a broader sense, and just some perspectives and approaches around understanding and healing intergenerational trauma. So maybe we'll start off with just kind of some definitions of trauma, because I think we hear that word so much now, like,
Definitely.
Yeah, we were talking about like social media and just how everyone is talking about mental health and trauma. It's just like it's thrown
Everywhere.
around.
Yeah.
So maybe let's like set the stage a little bit and look at some definitions. So I know you pulled up a definition. Do you want to read that off?
Sure. This is from the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation. Individual trauma results from an event, series of events, or set of circumstances experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, with lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being.
Okay. Yeah, I don't think I've ever heard that definition before, but it's pretty in line with, I think, a lot of others. There's some similarities there. I feel like it's broad enough, talking about like the physical and emotional impact. The key being if it's harmful or if it's life-threatening, like the individual perceives it
For
to
sure.
be that way.
Yeah.
And that there's long-lasting effects on those different elements of your well-being.
That's right. And I think, like, within that, trauma is a very broad phenomena, but what is traumatic for one person may not be traumatic for another person.
Yeah.
So it's all in the interpretation and how you receive that in your own circumstance or situation. And, I guess it would be the makeup of who we are and how we process things.
Yeah.
That can determine, kind of the outcome of that event.
Yeah, totally. There's so many factors that affect it. I feel like when I first went to school and was understanding psychology and like using the DSM and all of that, which the DSM is not all that, but I feel like there was a lot more emphasis on the events as a way to define trauma, that trauma meant like physical abuse.
Right.
Trauma meant a car accident where you witnessed a death, or like it was really specifically tailored to the actual event or experience.
Right.
And that's just not the case. Something can be, like, it's not the event that defines the trauma, it's the person's experience and the impact on them.
That's right,
Yeah. I know that a really popular kind of understanding of trauma has been circulating a lot, particularly in the last couple of years, and that comes from Gabor Mate, who, he was a medical doctor and turned to research trauma and the effects of trauma on someone's health, and that kind of like started him on this journey, specifically focusing on addiction. But like he says a lot around trauma that I think is a really important dialogue for us to have, and brings kind of a different approach, maybe thinking about trauma differently than we have in the past, getting away from that sort of medical model and looking more at what happens in our body.
Right. Yeah.
So I know one of the ways that he describes it is trauma isn't what happens to you, it's what happens inside of you as a result of what happened to you. And there's still like a lot of debate around that, and it's kind of the other end of the spectrum from the DSM, moving away from looking at or defining it by the event, but actually looking at the impact and how it manifested in you.
Right.
And I do think that's really important to look at. But then some people are also saying like, well, it kind of takes away from the actual event, or they feel like it almost minimizes the event or the experience and says like it's something just inside of you, not what happened to you.
Right.
But to someone who, let's say was physically abused, they're like, no, the physical abuse fucked me up, like that was traumatic.
Yeah.
So
I
what
mean,
do you think?
I see that as two separate things. So I don't think we should ever minimize an actual event that happened, whether it is a car accident or whether it's domestic violence or whether it's sexual abuse. There's real processing and acknowledgement and validation and perhaps, legal or justice avenues for the perpetrator or the event or whatever. And that I just see that as an external part of the whole package. So
It's still a piece of the puzzle.
it's still a piece of the puzzle. So even like thinking of it like an egg or something, right? There's a shell, there's the whites, and there's the yolk, and it all makes up the whole egg. But each part has a different purpose or plays a different role. And to me, I just think that, and I'm speaking from my own experience, like there has to be understanding, education, and healing through both of those arms, the internal part and the external part, because we are affected by the external event, whether it be an event or whether it be a person, that can completely influence how you view the world or how you view people, people in leadership or whatever it was that happened for you. And then the internal piece is definitely, again, I can't speak to all the science and the research on this, but I can speak from my own experience that the impacts are great internally.
Yeah.
And they do affect all areas of your life internally. So, yeah, I would say it's not one or the other. It's like a combination, like you're saying.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think like trauma is so subjective and it's so personal. And I believe, and I think you believe this as well, but like it's not, nobody has the right to tell you what your experience was or, what was trauma or, that wasn't traumatic. You should have seen what I went through. Like that whole idea, and we'll get into that. But I think, focusing more on that individual impact, like you're saying, how it affects all those different elements of our being.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I think the way that I generally think of trauma is like something, whether that was an event or a period of time that was a stress or a threatening, feeling a threat that overwhelms you. So it's something that's ongoing. It's more than you can process. It's more than you can keep up with, to cope with. And you are overwhelmed, and because of that overwhelm, you have to find a way to cope or survive that event or situation.
Yeah.
That's kind of the way that I think about it. What about you?
I do too. And also, I think something that is a traumatic event or affects your perspective of yourself and the world that you view. And I think it's something that drastically changes that view of yourself and the outside world to a point where it's a hurdle or a barrier to be able to function in a healthy way.
Yeah.
And we don't always know that that's the case because we create all these ways of adapting to be able to function within ourselves, even if we're experiencing something in silence that nobody else knows about. The human condition is very resilient, right? So we do things to survive.
Yeah, it's so true. I just think about like the work that Terry Real has done around understanding trauma and family dysfunction. I know a lot of what he speaks about comes from Pia Melody as well, who's like a child abuse, family violence, renowned practitioner. And he kind of talks about, it's not necessarily like in childhood, the overt kind of trauma you think of where it's, your parent is an alcoholic or your parent is violent, they're abusive. Sometimes it's what isn't there that should be there, or what is there that shouldn't be there. So there's the direct, overt violence that is traumatic for children, but then there's also the neglect piece, what's missing.
Right, yeah.
So I think we're getting a lot better at talking about and understanding trauma, understanding just how complex it is, how personal it is. There's just so many layers to it.
Yeah, such a wide variety of experience, right?
Yeah, and that, that research is so ongoing. I feel like just have the tip of the iceberg still.
Yeah.
And I know I mentioned this in a previous podcast episode, but we have done a really poor job at researching non-white communities and heteronormative family systems and communities.
Absolutely.
And we just have so much to learn, and I feel like that's very much ongoing. And
it is, and I think that's the importance of talking about it, as we and many other people are, reading the research, listening to people who are well equipped with knowledge and understanding and science and experience that are teaching on these subjects.
Yeah, exactly. So if we move from, here's kind of like an overview, general understanding of trauma, and then when does it move into the point of becoming intergenerational trauma? So this is trauma essentially that is passed down within your family system. It's transmitted from one generation to another, is kind of like the broadest way you could explain it.
For sure.
Did you have another definition of it?
Not completely here. I think intergenerational trauma, this is from an article through the Boston University. It was written by several professors, and I just wrote down a snippet from the article. They were talking about intergenerational trauma is transmitted through attachment relationships, where the parent has experienced relational trauma and it has significant impacts upon individuals across lifespans, including predisposition to further trauma. So I thought that was an interesting way just to kind of summarize, you know, that it's through our attachment relationships that we kind of, I don't want to use the word osmosis, but it is in a way,
Right.
it can be overt, but it can be covert too.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I mean, I immediately think of my own family history, and absolutely, I mean, just simply put, as we grow as a child, we model behaviors that we see around us, whoever that person was in our life who was modeling. You know, it could have been a parent, it could have been a sibling, it could have been a grandparent or someone else. And that happens on an individual level as well as a community level, really.
Yeah, absolutely.
And culturally, like, you know, as a cultural whole, think about misogyny, and these things are modeled.
Yeah, like how we're socialized. I know that when I think about intergenerational trauma and think about like my own upbringing, my own experience, I definitely think of the internalization of misogyny and, you know, time that I spent with my grandmother, my great-grandmother, how that messaging was passed along, like,
Absolutely, yeah.
you know, about being ladylike, being proper,
A good girl.
being a good girl, being, you know, well-behaved, well-dressed, being quiet. Like, it's so typical, seen but not heard.
Yeah.
And, you know, that's not an experience that was, like, unique to
No,
me. That
no.
was, like, what everyone was being taught and saying. And
For sure.
those societal and cultural messages just being passed down and regurgitated in family systems, right? So yeah, it's really interesting to understand and kind of pull that apart.
Yeah. And I think also the history of, again, whatever situation you're in, and unfortunately, you know, we don't all have the ability or the privilege to know our history. But again, speaking from my own experience, you know, there was definitely traumatic events and systemic trauma happening in my previous generations that I didn't know about. You know, the secret, like the family secret, right?
Family secrets, that's...
And so each time, you know, let's say it was a relative of mine or somebody who was a caretaker for me, is experience their own trauma responses or just, you know, how they're coping in life, those ways of interacting with me are being transferred to me. And so it wasn't actually until I was quite a bit older that the conversations opened in my own family. And I realized, you know, this past historical trauma, which really helped me in kind of dealing with my own trauma, you know?
Yeah, exactly.
So it's like unlocking the door.
Yeah, it's so true. Like, for us as women, the experience that, like, has connected all women and probably been the most systemic systemically passed down piece is just gender-based violence and, you know, women being oppressed in a patriarchal society. And, you know, we are still in a patriarchal society. Equality and equity is a whole other topic. We are definitely not there yet, but it's, you know, it was more overt in, you know, the generations before me, just, you know, being able to have the right to vote and like wearing pants to the grocery store. I'm not going to get dirty looks, like, right? And so there's some things that have really changed, but it still gets passed down. You know, even just the fear of existing as a woman, you know, being taught how to yell for help, that you don't yell for help because no one will answer, but you yell that there's a fire and then people will come, or like walking under street lights, holding your keys in your hand a certain way. Like every young woman is brought up with that messaging or similar messaging about you need to be afraid and you need to always, you know, watch over your shoulder and
lock your doors.
Don't talk to anyone, don't trust anyone. Like we're brought up that way, and I think that's such an intersection of the our culture, how we're socialized, but then also how that messaging seeps into our own families on top of any abuse or oppression or violence that's happening just within the home, within the four walls of the home.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's mind-blowing.
Yeah. So when I think about intergenerational trauma, I know another definition of it is historical trauma. And I'm not a huge fan of that definition. I know there's been a lot of negativity around understanding it that way, and kind of for obvious reasons that it's not necessarily just what has happened historically, but it's also what continues to happen, what gets passed down and carried forward and remains kind of the legacy of what has happened historically.
Right.
And I think we really see this, you know, when we look at colonization and understanding, you know, intergenerational trauma and that impact on Indigenous communities, you know, looking at residential schools, knowing that the last residential school, I was 3 years old when the last one closed. So it's not that historic.
Right.
And, you know, when you were talking about like attachment, understanding the experience of attachment, how that would impact a child, how that would impact an individual being forcibly removed from their home, being, you know, placed into an institution and forced to change your name, forced to speak a different language, forced to dress a certain way, to stop using your traditional practices and ceremonies or not be able to learn them. You know, knowing that Indigenous children were removed from their communities and their families specifically to, quote unquote, kill the Indian in the child. And they felt that keeping them in the community and letting them have relationships with their families would mean that they continue to use their language and practice their teachings and their traditions and their ceremonies. And, you know, thinking about the amount of Indigenous people who, you know, when they returned to their communities, if they survived, not having that connection, 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 not not maybe knowing where to start, not speaking the same language, not having access to, to that traditional knowledge, and how that would affect the next generation or the generations that are after. So, I mean, sometimes we hear like, that's historical, that happened in the past, and, we can't forget that Indigenous communities continue to face oppression, discrimination, racism, just really being able to understand. And like, as a white settler, I have limits to what I can understand,
Of course,
right?
yeah.
But knowing the modern day scoop, looking at the disproportionate numbers of children and youth who have gone into our foster care system and, been essentially taken again from their community, from their culture,
Right.
Removed from their homes, just that ongoing impact. So it's not something that is just historical, but is ongoing. And so when we think about, Black communities, Indigenous communities, equity deserving groups, folks who have historically and continue to be marginalized in our societies, you have the historical context and historical trauma, genocide and oppression, but then there's also what continues to happen.
Right.
And so there's this compounding, intersecting impact that, creates unique barriers to being well. You mentioned earlier, like, the privilege to even learn about your family history.
For sure.
The privilege to understand intergenerational trauma, like having access to your ancestors, being able to go on ancestry.com or whatever it is and, have a trail to follow. That unfortunately is a privilege, and not everybody has access to that. So
For sure.
it's such a unique, and, not even boxing everybody into, this one category of, either this or that, but there's been multiple experiences and, multiple different aspects and elements of identity that play a part in understanding this. And, that's why understanding intergenerational trauma is so personal, so unique to, like you were saying earlier, who you are, your personality, your experience with community, your relationship to society and oppression. It's just, there's so much to understand and really consider when it comes to, diving into this topic.
It's huge.
Yeah.
I mean, so many variables. My mind just gets flooded.
Yeah.
So many variables from generations, history, different people groups, your own, family, or, what's the word? Environment that you grew up with, the outside influences. I mean, there would be multiple combinations of experiences. And I think that's really important, which we will touch on a little bit later, is understanding what is being trauma informed, because I think it's so important when we are having these conversations to understand our own biases. And we're coming from our own lens, But where the education piece comes in is opening up the conversations and the discussions to understand somebody else's lens.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Like, I know one of the examples that I was just doing some research, like kind of preparing for this topic, and one of the examples I read from the Black experience, talking about the pressure from parents, grandparents to, you know, be perfect, have 3 jobs and be in school, and everything that you do is in the context of your family unit or your community and how you're representing them, or, you know, thinking of, you know, children of immigrants, you know, what your parents gave up, what they sacrificed to be there, you know, maybe what they've survived. And so this idea that, like, you know, I can't complain about anything, or I can't say that I'm struggling because I'm never going to struggle as much as my parents did.
Right.
I can't tell them that. Or, you know, I would disappoint them, I'd be letting them down. And so just this amount of pressure to be perfect and also to fit into, you know, what our society decides, who our society decides to value and uplift, you know, trying to be white enough that I'm accepted, but not too white that I'm outcast from my community, and just, yeah, this constant pressure. It's just, there's so many complexities, and I just think we really need to talk openly about that and do our bit to understand that better, and just never making assumptions about someone's experience. There's different parts of our identity, some that are visible, some that are invisible, and always, again, we'll go over this more when we talk about trauma-informed practice, but just allowing for those complexities to exist, and making space for someone's really unique situation. I think, you know, it can be really touchy, and it's something we've definitely confronted as we talk openly about intergenerational trauma, is like, you don't want to upset each other. You feel like, okay, I have these roles, I have to be this role, I have to be the parent, or I have to be the kid. We can't talk about certain things, or, you know, I don't want to hurt your feelings, or I don't want you to be mad at me, or, right? And so there's all this, all these complex dynamics happening, but I do think it's really important to, you know, if you have the opportunity, which, you know, luckily we do, to be able to just talk super openly about it and recognize that, you know, this isn't the Jenn Minthorn and Abbi Minthorn story. Like, this isn't made just for us. It's not, it's something that many people can relate to.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think a key aspect that you just mentioned was assumptions. And I think, you know, I'm not saying there haven't been moments where we've had conversations that have brought up intense feelings or whatever, but we always go into these conversations trying to leave the assumptions out of the conversation and entering into the conversation with full transparency in a loving, supportive way.
Yeah.
And that's not always available to people.
Yeah.
And it may not be available directly with the people that you would like to have those conversations with. Yeah. But there are other people who you can have those conversations with that will help support this open discussion. And the point of that is to take the blinders off and to take the secrecy out of it, and to be able to be transparent without judgment so that we can move forward in healing.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. Yeah, it's such an art, and it can be a really touchy subject. But again,
Yes.
if you have the opportunity, or, you know, again, we'll get into this in a little bit, but just finding support where you can, if it's through a third party, maybe there's a therapist. Many therapists, you know, are looking at doing family work. You know, if you are part of a specific identity or community, going to a therapist with similar heritage or similar identity, who's going to understand that experience and understand those nuances, and you know, be able to know, hey, how about your parents? Do they want in on this conversation, or do you want them in on this conversation? There's just so much to consider. Yeah.
For sure.
One of the things too that I just wanted to touch on, and I'm not going to get too into it because it doesn't necessarily change the outcome or the impact of intergenerational trauma, but just one of the things that's being discussed right now is the idea of epigenetics and how that, you know, how that contributes to intergenerational trauma. And, you know, just this idea that we pass on genetics, we pass on traits in our DNA that can be passed down to the next generation, and they experience the same thing. And this is really complex, and I'm not a neuroscientist or epigeneticist or anything like that. My knowledge is just wee tip of the iceberg, but you know, what we do know is that, for example, a child in utero does feel and, you know, take on some of what their mother is experiencing at the time, or what they're feeling, you know, their environment. You know, they can take that on. And we also know that, you know, they can reverse that, like, you know, through stability, through the right supports, through having secure attachment, you know, as they grow up. You know, it's the brain being plastic, like neuroplasticity, right?
That's right.
So we can create new neural pathways and, you know, not be doomed to this.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, because our environments and the things that happen in this world we can't always control those. In fact, most of the time we can't control that. So, you know, the term I've used before with you, the human factor. You know, it is essentially the human factor that we are all going to experience the impacts of some degree of trauma. It's unavoidable. But the key, like you said, is that there also is science behind reframing the mind, you know, creating new neural pathways that will bring healthy experiences and a healthy outlook. And because you could jump into that doom and gloom, like, oh, we're all doomed, forget it, like, you know. I know for myself, when I was carrying my children, it was a turbulent time in my life. And if you go to that place where you bring on the guilt and shame, it doesn't do anybody any good.
No. And it doesn't mean that having those feelings come up, like, that's not wrong. That's like a normal response and like a sign of your humanity, and something that can probably connect you to so many other mothers. And, you know, it's also something that, like, you don't have to live there or it's not like a trait that belongs to Jenn Thorne. It's something
Yeah.
that is a natural result of the intersecting and overlapping experiences you were having at that time.
That's right. Yeah.
Right? And just so many, like you said, external factors that play into, you know, our overall wellness. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think like one good kind of reference or piece related to that is the ACEs study. So this is the Adverse Childhood Experience Study. And this study was done, I want to say like, I don't actually remember when it was done, but it was over a 20-year period. I think it was maybe through the 90s. And, you know, this was really looking at the early childhood experiences and seeing if, you know, the more you've experienced adversity in early life, is there a link or a connection to experiencing long-term negative health outcomes.
Right.
So this was kind of broken up into a few different categories. I think 10 different, about 10 different things. So it could be neglect, you know, coming back to something that should have been there that wasn't, maybe that secure attachment, validation, being told that you're loved, feeling love from a parent, and then more overt things that shouldn't have been there, like, you know, physical violence, sexual violence, you know, worrying about a parent's mental health, having a parent commit a crime or go to jail or be absent, addiction, you know, the legacy of addiction in the family. I'm trying to think of what else. And you can just do a quick Google search of the ACEs and you'll see them come up. So, you know, I think this research is an important kind of question mark. It gives us kind of a question mark.
Yeah.
You know, something to ponder. So the more early childhood adverse experiences you had, the more high risk of having negative long-term health outcomes. That could be physical, it could be emotional, psychological. So, you know, linking it to like physical disease or linking it to certain mental health challenges. And so, you know, again, that's something to be aware of and consider. We were talking about earlier, like that impact on, am I crazy?
Yeah.
Do you want to touch on that? Like,
sure. So, you know, I think, again, I will speak from myself. You know, dealing with the impact of trauma and maybe coming from a place of not even recognizing that you have been impacted by a trauma, which for a lot of us, we have gone through parts of our life in that kind of sense that I don't know what's wrong with me, you know. And especially if it's something that was in your early childhood that maybe you don't recognize or remember. And so there's this element of everybody else seems to be coping in life really well, and I'm experiencing all these things, whether it's, you know, an impact on my mental health or whatever. And the narrative begins to be, you know, I'm irrational and I'm out of control and I must be crazy and I don't know what's going on with me. And I think, you know, once you have an open door that you are able to talk about this with somebody that you trust, and in society, as the discussion becomes more transparent, we're able to normalize and recognize that we're not crazy. These are normal responses and reactions and stressors and struggles that millions of people are experiencing. And, just related to what you were saying about the ACEs study, is that getting this information out there, this research, helps us to assimilate ourselves in a healthy way, to say, yes, I'm experiencing this. There's an explanation.
Yeah.
There's a valid explanation. And this is a common thread for people who are dealing with the impacts of trauma or post-traumatic stress disorder or whatever. And it can really help in your journey of healing and becoming well.
Yeah, totally. Well said. I think it can help us be pointed in the direction of looking at our early life and saying, it's not just in my head. There's something to this, and maybe there's something I need to look at here. And so I think it's a really great tool that way. It's definitely not meant, I think some of what I've seen happen with it is people use it as like a screening tool.
Right.
Like looking at a causal link, like this equals this.
Right.
Or like, oh, you've experienced 3 or 4 on the ACEs scale, and so that means that you're going to have whatever disease, or you're going to have anxiety or whatever. And it does not work like that, just to be clear.
Yeah. Kind of like the personality tests, where you just end up pigeonholing somebody in a box, which is that's not going to fly.
We're just
We're just too complex.
Yeah, we're just way too complex to be boxed in like that. So definitely not something we want to oversimplify. And it's not something that's meant to be the be all end all. But looking at it as a tool, I think there's a lot of value in understanding it. I know that it's still being researched. Again, it's pretty new, so we're still really understanding and learning more about that. But I think it is a good way to, again, get us on the right track of maybe digging deeper. Yeah.
One thing that just kind of came up for me, and this was actually a few days ago when I was thinking and preparing for this podcast, is, I think it's really important to say also that we're not coming from a lens of like, I don't even know what the right word would be, but like quantifying your trauma. Like any of these podcasts we do is for information and education. And so I feel like I have to say this just because of my background, from where I came from in my own history, that, these podcasts are not meant to be like, you're not doing it good enough. You've got to do more, and you got to heal, and you got to get better, and like this trauma you're carrying is.
I hope that's not how we're coming across. I really hope not, but yeah.
But I think it's important to say that, because even through the course of my own life, it can be difficult to hear about healing if you're not in a place where you're just not feeling like you're healthy. And so there's meant to be no shame, or this is not a performative thing where it's like, get all your ducks in a row and do all these things and tick them off and move forward. Kind of that striving to be well is not where we're coming from. this is a evolutionary healing process, and it's ongoing, and just being sensitive and caring towards yourself, having empathy and compassion for whatever you're experiencing right now.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And like, obviously we do promote wellness, and we do
Yes, we do.
want to encourage folks to use tools or have access to tools to, increase their overall wellness. But that's not, like, again, a one size fits all, or like coming from a place of like you said, you're doing it wrong, or you're not trying hard enough.
Yeah.
I think that's one thing that I really do appreciate about Gabor Mate's work around understanding trauma, is just really removing the shame from it.
Yeah.
And not pointing the finger to say, like, you failed, you didn't try hard enough, you weren't a good parent, you weren't a good kid. We have to remove all of that. Or, it's not that feeling guilty or feeling ashamed is wrong. It's, again, a justified feeling.
Yeah.
It's a sign of your humanity, which is not a bad thing. We take the good and the bad, and right? But we just don't want to live there. We don't want to get stuck there.
Right.
Because it's not all on us as individuals.
No.
And there's so many systemic factors, there's so many external factors that play into our overall wellness. What kind of barriers there are to us being well, being able to understand ourselves, the complexity, our family systems. And so, yeah, one individual could never be blamed for all of it. Like,
No.
Yeah.
I mean, you've said this to me several times over the course of our lifetime and conversations. You did the best you could with what you had at the time.
Yeah.
And that goes for all of us.
Everybody does.
That's how life works.
Yeah.
And in the midst of our own brokenness and our, whatever your situation is, you're doing the best with what you have.
Yeah.
And so taking that shame out of it is really important.
Yeah. Yeah. I genuinely believe people are doing the best they can. I think people want to do the best they can. And, in terms of resources, there is a documentary that Gabor Mate did. It's called The Wisdom of Trauma. And I do really like that concept of the wisdom of our trauma, understanding that whatever ways we cope, whatever ways we survive, there's that idea of like maladaptive strategies, and there's a lot of controversy around using it, because some people are like, well, it's adaptive, like we have to have ways to survive, and that's what our body is meant to do, is to protect us and help us survive. So I do think it's important to recognize that, I may have done things in the past that I'm not proud of, or I'm in a different position now than I was then.
Yeah.
And so I have different resources. I have different choices now. And to forgive ourselves, to let that shame stay there and not carry forward, because, we are older now. We're in a different place. We have more knowledge, and recognizing that whatever I did to survive in the past, that allowed me to survive. I'm here,
right? Yeah.
Right? I'm still here. And I think it's important to understand the wisdom behind that.
Yeah. For sure.